Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. Got a little lecture here for you on desert ecosystems. And what I've done is I've kind of combined, not kind of, I've combined two lectures into one. Usually I spend a whole lecture on plant adaptations um, for desert ecosystems and then talk about the desert ecosystems we have in North America. And so for this semester, what I've done is just I'm going to talk about a couple plant adaptations that I think are important to know about in desert ecosystems, and then a little bit of an abbreviated lecture on the desert ecosystems we have in the U.S. And like the last one, I've tried to annotate some of the slides a little bit more than normal. And so there might be some slides I kind of breeze over, but you'll need to go back to those slides and look through them more carefully as you complete the quiz for this lecture. Okay, so desert ecosystems are really my favorite ecosystems. I kind of like extreme things, and I guess I got into plants initially thinking and visiting desert ecosystems and just thinking about the extreme conditions the plants that grow there have to survive. And that got me really intrigued in plant function in general. And so it's always been a favorite place of mine. So let's go ahead and talk about these couple adaptations. So the first adaptation is CAM photosynthesis, and so we're just going to talk about this real briefly. But CAM photosynthesis is the third type of photosynthetic pathway that we see in plants. So there's three pathways. This is the third one, and we've talked about C3 and C4 photosynthesis. And so CAM is a different evolutionary adaptation to perform photosynthesis. Just a couple summary things. And going back to C3 photosynthesis, remember that first step, the first product of photosynthesis is a 3-carbon molecule, and that's where the name comes from. But remember, there's this potential for photorespiration during photosynthesis, and that's when Rubisco reacts with an oxygen molecule and results in really a loss of CO2 or carbon from the plant. And remember, the plant's working really hard to get carbon, and so any loss of that is kind of a detrimental thing. In order to minimize that photorespiration in C3 plants, they need to have a steady supply of CO2 into that stomate. And so what they do is they keep their stomates wide open to get CO2 supply into the leaf, but then of course that allows water to leave at the same time. So C3 plants tend to use water at really high rates, and they also need to be in occur in cooler places. Here, I'm going to move my image so you can see that bottom bullet point, because remember, Rubisco starts reacting more readily with oxygen the warmer it gets. So if plants are at cooler temperatures, that's going to also minimize photorespiration. But those two things, the high water use and the cool temperatures, that kind of limits where C3 plants can occur. And so we've already talked about C4 plants being adapted to warmer and drier conditions. And CAM plants likewise also are adapted to warmer and drier conditions. I didn't put a summary slide for C4, but if you remember, C4 photosynthesis occurs or minimizes photorespiration because it spatially separates Rubisco from oxygen. So as oxygen comes in through the stomate, Rubisco is over in the bundle sheath cells isolated from the oxygen. And so the Rubisco never really has access to the oxygen coming in through the stomates. So it's a spatial separation of Rubisco and oxygen. CAM plants have a slightly different way. They temporally isolate Rubisco from oxygen. And they do that by kind of dividing up when they do their photosynthesis between daytime and nighttime. So this diagram here kind of shows these two times in a plant and kind of what's going on from a photosynthetic standpoint. So at night, what's going on is that the stomates open at night so that CO2 can get into the leaf. But notice this PEP carboxylase, that should sound familiar because that's the first enzyme that reacts with CO2 in C4 photosynthesis. And if you remember, in C4 photosynthesis, you've got PEP carboxylase reacts with CO2 and then transfers it into the bundle sheath cells to give it to Rubisco. In this case, everything happens in the same place, it's just separated again by time. So PEP carboxylase reacts with CO2 at night and then stores the product as malic acid or malate. And it stores it in a compartment within the cell called the vacuole. Then in the daytime, the stomates actually close, and the plant then uses the energy, the light energy, and pulls that malate out of the vacuole and then gives it to rubisco. All right, and so this is kind of this diagram here. This black ball with the two red balls is a CO2 molecule, gets handed into the chloroplast where the rubisco is. And then photosynthesis proceeds as it would in C3 plants. So it instead of separating rubisco from oxygen in space within the leaf, it actually does it in time. Rubisco is inactive at night when the CO2 is coming in, but then it gets activated during the daytime when the stomates are closed. At night, the humidity goes up. The energy to drive evaporation, that solar energy, is also gone. And so there's a lot less evaporation from the leaf, or essentially then a lot less transpiration from the leaf when a plant has its stomates open at night. So it's a way to conserve water in CAM plants. So just a couple notes on this. CAM comes from the word crassulaceae. So the C in CAM plants stands for crassulaceous acid metabolism. That's what the CAM stands for. And so the C comes from the family Crassulaceae. It is not restricted to Crassulaceae. There are other families, plant families, that utilize CAM photosynthesis. It's just where it was first discovered, and that's kind of that name stuck. Remember, it's a temporal separation between rubisco and oxygen, and that allows very high water conservation. But we don't see CAM plants occur that many places. They are really constricted to pretty hot and dry places. And that's because there's multiple additional steps in the photosynthetic process. And so it's really energetically expensive. And so if it's cooler and wetter, a C3 or C4 plant is gonna outcompete a CAM plant. But in those kind of extreme environments, that CAM photosynthesis can be an advantage. Okay, the other thing I'm just going to touch on briefly are biological soil crusts. In the video where I talked with Sasha, she mentioned biological soil crusts. And these aren't just in deserts. They're found in semi-arid, like they'll be out on the short grass steppe in some of the open areas. There's some down in the San Juan Valley. There's lots of places where you'll have biological soil crusts. So they extend beyond just deserts, but this is kind of where they're maybe you would say they serve the biggest role in the ecosystem function, and it's also kind of where they were discovered and we first started researching them in desert communities. So they're a community of organisms that form a living or protective membrane on the soil surface. This is just a list of the type of organisms that tend to be found in biological soil crust. So cyanobacteria, mosses, lichens, algae, bacteria, fungi. It's kind of all of these things working together. And this image just shows kind of different types of biological soil crust. So in A, here there's very little, it's not well formed. And if you kind of see this blackish kind of texture, or not texture, but color on the soil surface, that's actually cyanobacteria. And cyanobacteria is really important for the biological soil crust because these organisms are nitrogen fixing. And so they tend to be the ones that first colonize an area and develop because they can take nitrogen out of the air and utilize it for their biomass. And then that adds nutrients to the soil. Let's just go to the extreme. If we look at D, C and D, these are, you can see, here's a scale bar of 1 centimeters. So that the vertical structure of this biological soil crust is a few centimeters tall, which would be a little over an inch. And so you can get some, decent texture on the soil surface where the biological soil crust occurs. And so I just wanted to highlight the person that really kind of started studying and revealing the importance of biological soil crust was Jane Belknap, and she works with Sasha, or Sasha works with her in that USGS Moab unit. And so Jane is, she's really creative, thinks outside the box, and she just kind of started studying it when everybody else thought it was unimportant, and really identified how important it was to the functioning of these dryland ecosystems. So here's just one figure from one of her many papers. On the x-axis here we have the cover of soil, biological soil crust, going from, on the left, 0% cover, so there's nothing there, to 100% cover, where the soil surface is covered completely by the soil crust. On the y-axis we have sediment removal, so how much of the soil particles are removed from an area. And what you see is that when there's no biological soil crust, lots of sediment gets moved through wind, primarily wind and rain. But when we have 100% cover, almost none of that soil is removed from a particular area. This is similar, has a similar effect for soil moisture. I don't think I put this figure here, but if you have high biological soil crust cover, you have higher soil moisture because it prevents evaporation. So it really you can think about it as this membrane on the soil surface protecting both the loss of soil from a system, but also the loss of water from a system as well. So here's just a few key functions of the biological soil crust. Prevents erosion, prevents evaporation, promotes microbial activity, nutrient accumulation, and facilitates plant community development. There's some seeds that need the biological soil crust to germinate or to maximize germination. Okay. The other thing I'll just say here is that this biological soil crust is fairly easily damaged and can take a long time to recover. So the biological soil crust you saw in the image where it was like maybe an inch, the kind of vertical structure was about an inch, that might have taken 100 years to develop, or 50 years even. So to get those really complex biological soil crust developed, it can take decades, many decades. But just one step on that, or some traffic on that biological soil crust disrupts it. So it can be really fragile and take a long time to recover. So in dryland ecosystems, thinking about the soil crust is really important in the management of those systems. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about a couple adaptations of desert ecosystems and a couple things that are really important. Okay, let's talk about the actual desert ecosystems we have in the U.S. We'll talk about what differentiates them and kind of how the flora differs between them, and then we'll talk about some general management issues with desert ecosystems. Okay, so in North America, we have 4 major desert ecosystems: the Mojave Desert, the Sonoran Desert, the Chihuahuan Desert, and the Great Basin Desert. And we divide those into warm deserts and cold deserts. So we have 3 warm deserts: Sonoran, Mojave, and Chihuahuan, and 1 cold desert, the Great Basin. And what separates them is obviously temperature, but I have never seen a great definition of how cold it has to be considered a cold desert. Most of the definitions I see have to do with that it gets a lot of its precip, or a significant amount of its precipitation, as snow. So that helps differentiate the cold deserts from the warm deserts. So in these warm deserts, we would expect pretty much 0 snowfall in a given year. There's rare occasions where it does happen, but it's again rare. Okay. So let's first talk about the location of our deserts. So if we look at this map of where our deserts are, generally in the southwestern United States, and there's 2 reasons for that: the Hadley cells and the orographic effect. So if you remember the Hadley cells, way back to early on in the semester, this is a diagram of the Hadley cells. Here's the equator running through the Earth. Remember, around the equator you have warmer air. That's where the warmest air is, and so it's rising away from the Earth's surface. And as that air rises, it cools, the water condenses and precipitates out. Because this is a low pressure system at the equator, new air from higher latitudes is moving toward the equator to fill that gap. And so the air that rose away from Earth's surface kind of gets pushed north and south and descends about 30 degrees north and south. Because the air precipitated out near the equator, that air is really dry. And so that's where we get a lot of our desert ecosystems at around 30 degrees north and south. And so our deserts all fall between 25 and 35 degrees. And so we're kind of like centered on that 30 degrees north and south. So that's one reason our deserts occur in kind of the southern part of the United States. The other part that's really about the western portion of the continent is the orographic effect. All of our deserts sit kind of between these mountain ranges. So if you look at the map here and where deserts occur, they're occurring in this kind of southwestern portion, and then the Chihuahuan Desert is a little bit further over here on in the east side of this region, kind of eastern Mexico. And so most of our weather patterns are coming from the west, and so the air masses that hit our deserts are all having to move over the Sierra Nevadas and the mountain ranges, which I'm forgetting the names of in Mexico right now, Sierra Madres and something else. The weather patterns are moving over those mountains, and so most of the moisture is precipitated out at the high elevations in those mountains, and so then what hits the deserts on the other side is dry air, and that creates it adds to the dryness of these deserts. Okay, so that's orographic effect and Hadley cells. Now let's talk a little bit about the warm desert and what differentiates them. It's both the amount and the seasonality of precipitation that cause these deserts to be different and have different vegetation. So if we look on the left hand figure, we have the elevation and temperature, and we know there's a tight correlation between these things. The symbols in this figure represent data from the 3 warm deserts. And so these symbols over on the far right at the highest elevation, these are the Chihuahuan Desert, and then we have Sonoran and Mojave on the left-hand end. Because of this relationship between temperature and elevation, we also have a relationship between elevation and precip. So again, here's some symbols from different desert ecosystems. On the far right, we have our highest elevation and lowest elevation on the left, and then precip. So our deserts that occur at the highest elevation tend to get the highest amount of precip, and those at the lowest elevation get the smallest amount of precip. So then here's kind of a summary that shows the amount and the timing of precip in our 3 desert ecosystems. So Chihuahuan Desert is our highest elevation, Sonora's intermediate, and Mojave is the lowest elevation. So if we start with the Chihuahuan Desert, we know because it's higher elevation, it gets more precip, but it also gets the smallest amount of precip in the winter. That means it's driven by summer rains versus the Mojave, which gets the least amount of precip, but is driven by winter precip. And then the Sonoran has a bimodal distribution, so it gets some of that winter precip and some of that summer precip, and it has the intermediate amount of precipitation. So let's just talk about why that is a little bit with this figure. We've looked at kind of high and low pressure systems in the U.S. before. Remember, when we're talking about the western U.S., though that's driven by Mediterranean climates, where we have this really dry summers, but the wet winter. And so the Mojave Desert, which is the furthest west, gets most of its weather patterns from the west coast and receives that Mediterranean climate, and so that's why it gets the winter precip. But of course, those weather patterns go up and over the mountains, so it's not getting a lot of winter precip, but that's the timing of its precip. We'll go to the other extreme. The Chihuahuan Desert is kind of over here in this parts of Texas, New Mexico, and northeastern Mexico. Most of the precip in Chihuahuan Desert comes from these summer monsoons that move up from the Gulf. And so those occur in the summer, and so Chihuahuan Desert is driven by summer precip. The Sonoran Desert is in between the Mojave and the Chihuahuan Desert, and so it gets a little bit of this winter precip from the Mediterranean and the west coast, and a little bit of the summer precip from the monsoon, and that's why it gets that bimodal distribution. So here's just a summary of that. Here's a ranking of the amount. I want you to remember and know the ranking. You don't have to remember the absolute values, but remember Chihuahuan's the wettest, Mojave's the driest. And then here's the seasonality. Chihuahuan Desert gets summer precip, Mojave gets winter, and Sonoran's intermediate. And then this is just productivity of our desert ecosystems. So here's the productivity of deserts in general, anywhere between 10, which is like almost nothing, to 250 grams per meter squared, which is getting close to the shortgrass steppe. And you can see our 3 deserts fall right in line with that. And you can see the ranking of of productivity is directly correlated to the ranking of precip. So Chihuahuan Desert gets the most precip, has the most productivity. Sonoran is intermediate. Mojave gets the least amount of precip and has the lowest amount of productivity. Okay, let's just talk briefly about kind of the vegetation characteristics of these desert ecosystems. The Mojave, again, is the driest desert, and it is really dominated in large part by annuals or ephemerals. Ephemerals are things that are not there all the time. And so annuals or biennials really contribute the most to the biodiversity of these ecosystems. Because it's in such a low amount of precip, you know, a really dry year, almost nothing's going to grow. But then every once in a while, it has a decently wet year. And so those annuals that can survive as seeds germinate and can complete their life cycle within a short period of time. Those are what is really common in the Mojave Desert. There are some perennial species. This is where Joshua trees are most common in the Mojave, and some dominant shrubs as well. In the Sonoran, this didn't update. Sonoran Desert, remember, so here I have high diversity of vegetation types, and then I say why. Oh, wait, I've got it on the next slide. I forgot I did this. All right, so visual for you, thinking about the Sonoran Desert, this is where we have the saguaro cactus being most common, those large kind of succulent plants. These are CAM, they utilize CAM photosynthesis. So why is the diversity of plants relatively high in the Sonoran Desert? And it's because of that bimodal distribution. So it supports plants that can grow in the winter, it supports plants that can grow in the summer, just not a lot of biomass for each of those. And then lastly is our Chihuahuan Desert, so relatively cool and moist compared to the other deserts. And so we have more vegetation, and this is where we have a lot more shrubs and grasses being dominant in the Chihuahuan Desert. So a lot of our desert grasslands occur in the Chihuahuan Desert. Okay, so those just a summary of the warm deserts. Let's talk briefly about the Great Basin, or the cold desert we have in North America. I'm not going to say a whole lot about this. I don't know why. We could spend a whole semester on the Great Basin. So I guess I went to the other extreme and almost don't talk about it at all. But the Great Basin is high elevation desert for the U.S. So most of the desert is between 4,000 and 6,500 feet. So we get a lot cooler temperatures and frequent frost events. And that's one of the main reasons we don't have a lot of succulents in the Great Basin. Succulents in general are a little more sensitive to cold and freezing temperatures. We do have prickly pear, most commonly in the Great Basin, does quite well in freezing temperatures, and there's a few other succulents you'll find, but not like the Sonoran or the Mojave. And this region is dominated really by shrublands and scrublands. There's a documentary, I forget if it was a nature documentary or what organization put it out, but it's called The Sagebrush Sea. And it's really about sage grouse, but it talks a little bit about the plants as well. And so the Sagebrush Sea really is the Great Basin. I mean, there's places that aren't dominated by sagebrush, but that's kind of where the sagebrush ecosystems occur most frequently, is in this Great Basin. And then, of course, as you get higher elevations or you get to riparian areas, you're going to see other vegetation showing up. But by large, the large amount of the land is dominated by shrubs and scrublands. All right, I guess that's all I'm going to say about Great Basin. So Gets more precip as snow than the other deserts, obviously colder, less succulents, dominated by shrubs and shrublands and scrublands. Okay, let's just talk about a few management challenges in desert ecosystems. One thing I'll point out, this is just a map of the public lands in every state. And I grew up in Michigan, so northern Midwest. And I always loved looking at maps of the Western US and just dreaming about all these public lands and places you could explore. And I imagine a lot of you ended out in this area for similar reasons. But what I want to point out is that, the most of the public lands we have in the United States are in the Western US, and much of this is dominated by a desert ecosystem. So I'm drawing a circle kind of where our deserts occur in the southwestern United States. And so my point here is that if you're going to work for a public agency, there's a really good chance you're going to end up in a desert ecosystem or a dryland ecosystem. So there are places with lots of federal jobs available because we have so much land in that category of a desert ecosystem. So just thinking about some of the management issues in desert ecosystems, there's lots of range in desert ecosystems. And so thinking about managing grazing is really important in managing desert ecosystems. Obviously, wildlife habitat is really important. Water quantity, water quality is really important because we have fairly large urban centers. Excuse me, I shouldn't burp in the middle of my lecture, but my coffee's starting to kick in. Water quantity, water quality, because there isn't much of it. So managing what there is important. And there's also some really large urban centers in desert ecosystems. And so then that puts more pressure on the water supply. Because there's so much land that's publicly accessible, we have lots of recreation on desert ecosystems, which kind of conflicts with the sensitivity of some of the flora and the biological soil crusts. And so that's kind of a tough issue to manage, and a fine line to balance, I guess. And then again, open areas for urban expansion, because there's all these open areas where we do have these large urban centers. There's less to constrict their growth. So this this diagram in the top right is the population of Arizona, and this is driven in large part by Phoenix, population increase in Phoenix. But you can see how rapidly the population is increasing. Las Vegas population has increased a lot over the last couple decades. Boise, which is kind of on the top edge of the Great Basin. So some of our fastest growing cities over the last couple decades have been in these desert ecosystems. So that's just kind of highlighting that expansion, increasing population, so increasing recreation and all of those other activities on these public lands. So that just kind of highlights these some of these really important management issues: climate change, urbanization, soil erosion, desertification. And then I'm sure you are all, whether you feel familiar or not, but you certainly heard about cheatgrass or other annual grasses. And they've really wreaked havoc on a lot of these desert ecosystems, because these desert ecosystems, I don't have a picture of it, but they are not adapted to fire. So there's just not enough fuel to carry fires, at least historically. And so with these annual grasses showing up, they actually provide fuel to carry fires. And of course, they're in really dry systems, and so the chance of ignition is fairly great. And so it's really changed the fire structure and had a big impact on the vegetation in desert ecosystems. And so a lot of the kind of most active research in cheatgrass and other annual grass invasions occurs around these different desert ecosystems. Okay, so that's all I've got for you on this lecture. So you can go ahead and watch that and then work on the quiz at the same time. And if you have any questions, let me know. That's it. We'll see you soon. Hopefully. Hope you'll see you on campus next semester.